My name's Aimee Deering, and this is all about my son and what happened with him, Ace Nolan. When we found out we were expecting last year, we were, of course, thrilled because, I mean, there's nothing better than a new little baby. All our kids were excited, and it was just a wonderful time. Couldn't wait to tell everybody about it. So we found out then at 14 weeks that he was a boy, and of course my husband was happier than anybody about that. And we immediately started getting his room ready and painting, and the nursery was now going to be his, and his brother was kicked out of there. So Zach got the room all ready, and we had everything painted, and we were decorating, and it was just, we were all, couldn't wait. We couldn't wait. We found out what he was going to be at 14 weeks. So by the time we got to our 20-week scan at the doctor's, we had a lot of stuff ready for him and couldn't wait. So we always take the kids with us when we're finding out, you know, or getting to see the baby again. And so we picked up my oldest boys from school, and we had the little ones with us, and we went to the lab. Before that, I had felt him move, you know, periodically, but it wasn't a ton. It was still early, and so I had no concerns. I had never had any kind of issues to have concerns. Everything's always gone smoothly. So we went that day for the 20-week scan, and we were waiting forever. And of course, they tell you to have a full bladder, so I finally I couldn't hold it anymore. I had to go to the bathroom and went in, and I was bleeding just a little. Something I had never experienced during any pregnancy. And so I came out and told my husband, you kind of whispered it to him because we did have, you know, all the kids with us. And, you know, he was kind of unsure, and, you know, maybe I'm sure it's not a big deal. And so we went in, but I just had a bad feeling. So we went in, and she began the ultrasound, and she immediately printed a picture for my daughter and handed it to her. And I kept watching the screen, and I knew I was looking for the heartbeat, and I didn't see it. And the ultrasound technician quickly covered my stomach and said, "I'll be right back," and she left the room. I knew what was happening, but I had my kids with me. So I was really trying to hold it together. And I couldn't say it out loud to Zach what I felt was going on. She finally returned and printed off one more picture quickly and said that the baby was just a little too small and she couldn't measure everything, and our doctor would call us. And I knew what was happening, so I was just trying to get the kids out of the room as quickly as I could. My husband kept asking her, I could hear him asking her, you know, what's going on? Tell us what's the matter. And she just told him again, the doctor will call. The doctor's office was right next door to the lab, so we immediately drove over there, and my husband went in and demanded to see our doctor, and he came walking past and came out and said, "Come in and wait." And he told him that the ultrasound technician had called him, and he wanted to check for himself. And so we came in and called my mother immediately to come pick up the rest of the kids, because I didn't want them to be there knowing that the doctor would have to tell us what had happened. So she came and got them, thankfully, before we went back. And he took us back to the room that he had with the ultrasound machine and started looking, and what felt like forever. Like he really wanted to be able to find it, to find his heartbeat and not have to tell us. To not have to tell us that she was right and it wasn't there anymore. But after about 45 minutes, he did say he hasn't made it. And he was very sorry and left us for a few minutes to kind of catch our breath. When he came back, my husband immediately asked him, you know, what do we do now? So he told us that what he likes to do is to try to wait and see if your body will go into labor on its own. That this had most likely, you know, just happened very recently, since I had just noticed this. And so he said he was going to send us home for the weekend and he would talk to me on Monday and see, you know, what's going on, unless I began going into labor. So we were home for 3 days waiting just to see if anything happened, and nothing. I just sat around trying to not fall apart. My doctor had told me a specific time to get to the hospital and assured me that they would be prepared for me if I arrived at this time. We actually were about 5 minutes late just because we couldn't find a parking spot. But when we got there and the guard called back to check us in, they weren't ready for me. And they asked me to sit down in the waiting room, which is the labor and delivery waiting room. And it wasn't where I wanted to be sitting with all these families that were there waiting for their babies, for their babies to be born healthy, knowing that we were not going to be leaving the hospital with our little boy. They finally came out and got me after about 10 minutes and said that my nurse wasn't there. She was in the middle of something and they were going to get me to my room. So they took us to this room that was it was just right off the hallway, not around anyone else, right next to a hall bathroom. And it was just very old and small and dirty, and you know, the window was kind of moldy, and it just was not, it just didn't help how I felt at the time at all. So within 30 minutes probably, the ultrasound technician came in the room with the machine to check about Ace's size and about just how he looked. She did that and couldn't really tell us anything. And so we just waited then for my doctor to get there later that day. We did have a nurse that came in to try to talk to me about the different ways that you can have the baby, that the doctor, you know, kind of will help you decide what's best, and if there's something you really want, you can push for that. And at that time, I didn't, you know, have any idea about stuff like this, and I didn't know what I should do. I just knew I wanted to see my son before I left. I was told by her that if I were to birth and be able to have him that way naturally, that for certain I would be able to hold him and see him, and they had this memory box that they could give me, which they did end up giving me. But if I couldn't and I had to go into surgery, that she just really didn't know what I would be able to get, that it's just not, you know, policy for you to see the baby after that. So when my doctor arrived later and he told us that he just really didn't think it was the best route for me to try to birth naturally, considering it had been 4 days at this point and I hadn't gone into labor on my own, and that with Ace's size, he was concerned that given the medication to make me labor, it could be days and it could do more damage to him and to me, and I could still end up in surgery. And when he told us that, I just kept telling him that I wanted to be able to see him. I wanted to know, you know, that I could see him. And he told me he didn't understand why I wouldn't be able to. That he knew he had to go to pathology, but he didn't see why I wouldn't be able to see my son if I still went the surgery route, which he thought was best for me. Me and my husband had to make a quick decision at that point because they were waiting to either begin one of two procedures. So for my safety, we chose to do surgery. We were concerned that since my body had done nothing to go into labor, that it wasn't going to work and I could still end up losing a lot of blood, they said, and be in surgery. And we didn't want anything to happen to me at that point. I think that's how my husband was feeling. He was just very nervous about something happening. The doctor got there that night and we opted to do the surgery because of my health and the way that he thought that Ace could be not in as good condition, because he said the ultrasound was showing signs of deterioration already, that he thought laboring for days and then to even that not work and have to have the surgery, that he could really end up getting almost crushed, for a lack of better words. And that's not at all what we wanted at all. I wanted to see my son and be able to have that time with him. I didn't want anything bad to happen to him more than it already had. So immediately once we decided to do the surgery, there were procedure that my doctor had to do that night and wait another 24 hours after for it to be done. And he realized then that they didn't have me in a labor bed that had stirrups or any extra room or for him to do this, and he was frustrated with that. He was having to sit on the end of my bed, and he started asking them for everything, and none of the nurses seemed to know what he needed, know what he was even talking about when he was asking for the tools and things. They just seemed like they really didn't know what was going on, and no one was really concerned. I mean, there was different ones poking their head in the door asking if this was what it was, and just nobody was ready, and no one seemed to really care that all of this talking and back and forth was just making it more difficult for me and what I was going through. There didn't seem to be much empathy for our situation, for them to handle it in a more delicate manner. It was just something that they were having to deal with that day, and wanted to get it done. So we then had to wait another 24 hours laying in this hospital room before I could have the surgery. That night, I wanted to try to be able to sleep, but they had us in an older room, and some of the equipment didn't work, and it kept malfunctioning and sending off the call button to the nurse. So I constantly had people coming in that night asking me what I needed and this and that and waking me up, and it didn't help at all make me feel any better about the next day, or even just how I was being cared for. It didn't seem like they really cared. They weren't trying to fix any of these things, and I just kept being disturbed from it, and it made everything a lot harder to deal with. And the next day, got there, we talked to the doctor again before we went in, and we reiterated again how important it was for us to see him, and I guess we maybe were a little nervous about that and if it was going to happen for sure, and we asked him to please try to get footprints for us before they sent him to pathology, because he did tell us that he immediately had to go to pathology. He knew that, but once they got the tissue that they needed, he didn't see why they couldn't bring him to our room. I was told that after the surgery, I was going to be taken to palliative care, which I didn't even know what that was to begin with. Once I found out what it was, it didn't make sense. I wasn't dying. I of course didn't want to be really in the mother-baby unit and like anywhere like that, but once I went into surgery, that's all we knew. My husband had to take my bags that we'd been there already for a day and a half, and take my things with him into surgery waiting, which I don't think is appropriate. I feel like I should have been in a room, and I should have stayed come back to that room. That just makes the most sense. It seems like the most caring thing to do, to not make somebody have to shuffle around the hospital when they're already dealing with this, because it wasn't only me, it was my husband. And it couldn't have been easy for him either. Once I woke up in recovery, I could hear them talking about it, and they didn't know where I was supposed to go, and they kept questioning it, and finally I heard them say that they were sending me to oncology. I mean, that definitely didn't make any sense to me. I don't have cancer. I didn't understand that at all. And it was obvious that they didn't have anywhere to send me, and they didn't know what to do with me. So they were sticking me somewhere where they had a bed. When we got there, they had put the memory box on my bed, and so we opened it up, because my husband told me that our doctor had told him that he did take footprints for us. That was shocking enough in that moment to see those, and to see the size of them, but they were perfect little footprints. The nurse then came in that was gonna take care of me and said, at this point it was almost time for a shift change. So she told me that she was gonna be leaving, and they told her I was allowed to go home if I wanted to. But she did say that, I would think you would want to rest a little bit. You haven't, gotten up or anything like that, and see how you're doing. We told her that our doctor told us that we were going to be able to see our son, that we would be able to see Ace once pathology had gotten the tissue that they needed from him. I was thinking that it would be that night. At this point, it was about 6 o'clock, and more than enough time. And so she said she would call and find out, but she was about to go home, and that maybe it would have to happen the next day. It wasn't what we wanted to hear by any means. We were ready to see him, but after just a little bit, when I got up, I definitely wasn't feeling well and hadn't really been eating and things, and then from anesthesia and whatnot, I was sick, and my husband then had to go and talk to the nurses and get things I needed, because whether I had given birth naturally or not, I had just had a baby, and there are things that you need, and where I was placed, they had no idea what I needed, and none of it was being taken care of. And my husband had to go find the nurse, and they had to figure out, you know, where to even get these supplies that should have been obvious, but weren't, because I wasn't in an appropriate place to be after having a baby. The next morning, the nurse came in, and we told her again. It was the same nurse from the night before, and she told us she would be back, and she said she was going to immediately start looking into getting him to us. She'd never dealt with this, so she wasn't sure. Every couple hours she kept coming back to the room, and she would just say that she was trying to talk to pathology, and they didn't think that he should come up. And we just kept pushing. I didn't know what my rights were. I didn't know if I legally could say, you have to, you know, bring me my child. I didn't know, but we just kept pushing. I didn't feel like I could leave there and not see him. I didn't want days to go by and have to go to the funeral home and do that. I wanted to see him then. I had already wanted to see him the night before. Finally, after lunchtime that day, she came in and she said, I don't want to upset you, but I really want to be honest with you about what's going on. She said that she had spoken to pathology, and she actually ended up speaking to the head of pathology, and they told her that they didn't understand why I would want to see him, and asked her if she would want to see a baby that small. And she immediately said, you know, it's not my child, so it's not for me to say, she told them. I just couldn't imagine why somebody would think that it was up to them to decide whether I wanted to see my son or not. It had nothing to do with pathology or their policies and things that they normally do. Maybe some people aren't as concerned about seeing their child, and it is frightening. But the things that they were saying to me were frightening me, and I didn't want to feel that way. I knew I wanted to see him, and I just didn't understand why they felt so strongly about me not seeing him. It wasn't their decision, I felt. It was our decision. He was my son, and they weren't allowing me to spend any time with him, have any kind of closure about the situation. She told me that the head of pathology was going to call me and talk to me about it, which never happened, ever. While I was at the hospital or after I got home, I never spoke to anyone in pathology. She told me that she felt that she should open a report with her supervisor, that they wanted to do that because they just didn't feel that what was happening was okay. And neither did I, and I was more than willing to have anyone come into my room and tell them why I thought what they were doing was wrong. So I did have the head of oncology come in, and I told her the situation and what had happened, and that my doctor had told me that he didn't understand why there would be any reason I couldn't see him. There's things they have to get tissue from him, but that was done. And I had then been told that he was in the morgue. So if he's just sitting in the morgue, I didn't understand why he couldn't be with me so that I could hold him. They also called for the head of labor and delivery to come to my room for her to do a report as well. And I told her why. I told them both the whole story, and they took their notes, and a nurse who was supposed to kind of be my advocate when I had gotten to the hospital, she came there too. And they finally told me that they were gonna go take a picture of him and that they could bring me that picture. I still at this point thought that that was all I was gonna get, and I was trying to be happy with that, but it didn't feel right. And I just kept telling them, I want to see him. I don't understand why, if he is there, why we can't see him. Why can't my husband at least go down and take his own pictures? I didn't understand, and I wasn't happy, and they knew that. I knew that my son was going to be perfect to me. Our doctor had told us that he looked great. He really looked great. He had a little problem where his arm had slightly detached, but he was in great condition. So I knew what I was gonna see was my perfect son. And everything they kept trying to say to me to make me not want to see him, I felt like was making the vision I had of him worse. The head of labor and delivery had told me she took a picture and they would get that to me. And honestly, when they left the room, that was it. They didn't say at that moment that they were going to let us see him still. They was just, we got this picture for you, and they weren't even going to be able to print it for me. I was going to have to come back to the hospital the next day and pick it up because they couldn't print it right then. And obviously, my feeling was they just wanted me out of there, that they couldn't even wait to get that done before I left. We felt completely defeated because they left the room pretty much saying, like, we have this for you, and that's all you're gonna get. I was so glad when they came back in and finally said that they could bring him to us. It felt amazing. She had already taken a picture of him, so she had told us she had put a hat on him and a blanket, and she had covered up where his arm was coming. All those things are things that I would have been glad to do myself. I would have been glad to put a little hat on him. But they took all that away from us, not giving us that time. When they brought him to our room, he was in like a Tupperware container that you would take like a potluck to someone's house. They had him zipped up in that, I'm assuming to keep him cooler, where he was then in his, it was a little box, it was kind of like a little casket. And so she had to unzip that and take that out and then open the lid. It was just such a disturbing way to present me with my child. We knew what had happened. We knew that he was physically here, but not spiritually here. I knew he was in heaven and this was just his body. But to have him closed up in a container when they get him to me was just so insensitive. And I don't know if it's because they didn't want to have to see him. But at that point, I don't think that should matter. What should matter is the parents and their child, not if the staff is comfortable with what they're having to deal with. And that's what I felt like they were doing, was just kind of trying to push me off because it's not something that they want to deal with. nobody wants to think that babies die, but it happens every day. I didn't need them to bring him in like that and make it more apparent to me. In that moment, I just had to be happy that he was finally with me and that my husband and I could take pictures and touch him and see him, and we needed that, and we needed to see him for ourselves, because the way they were trying to portray him wasn't at all how we were seeing him. To us, he was perfect. They told us we had as much time as we wanted, but they were also waiting outside the room. So to me, that isn't that you want me to spend as much time as I can with him, that's that you're rushing me. And at that point, he had been born for over a day, and I don't know how much care they were taking for keeping his body cool and keeping him where he wasn't going to be deteriorating more and having more signs of that he wasn't alive anymore. When we went to leave then, and the nurse had taken him back out, my husband was wheeling me out to the elevators, and they came walking up with Ace zipped up in this carrier insulated thing. And we're gonna get right on the elevator too. It was really hard to see him in that again. I just wanted to remember him how I had just seen him and held him and taken his picture. So that was just, it ended it again kind of on a sour note. We went home and we're just, trying to deal with everything. The next day, I was sitting on the couch and my phone rang, and I answered it, and it was a funeral home. I had yet to tell them where to send him. It was something I was going to have to make that decision about that day, but I wasn't there yet. I hadn't decided. But this funeral home tells me that they have my son, and they need to know what to do with him now. I was in complete shock because I'm still expecting him to be at the hospital and in the morgue, and now he's been transported somewhere, and I had no knowledge of it. I had no say in it. And the morgue didn't have a name. He just said your baby, and that bothered me in itself. I had told them at the hospital many times what his name was, but I knew that it only had my name on the box that they had sent him there in, and I immediately told him that I had no idea why that they had my child, and I was gonna have to call the hospital and figure out what was going on. I immediately called the head of labor and delivery. I had her information from speaking to her the day before, and she didn't know why this had happened, and they were going to try and figure it out, but she didn't have any answers for me right then. We went ahead and made the decision to leave him where he was at the funeral home and had him cremated. We did ask them to measure him for me because the hospital hadn't done anything like that. I didn't know how long he was. I didn't know what he weighed. I had already asked the gentleman that had called me from the funeral home to just verify to me that that was my child. At that point, I was nervous about whether they had even sent my baby or another baby. So I asked him to open it up, and I wanted him to take the blanket off of him and save it for me. And he did all those things, and he measured him, and he made sure that it was our child. There were things we knew that we could tell him to check for so that we would know. A few days later, we did go pick him up, and I finally heard back from the hospital, from the risk management, them saying that they're really sorry about the confusion that happened with him being sent to the funeral home, that apparently there was another baby in there at the same time, and they don't use names in these cases. So the same information had just gotten put on to my son's paperwork to go to that funeral home as this child. I was in shock when she was telling me this, and I just said okay, and hung up the phone. I didn't even know what else to say to her. I couldn't even believe that she was telling me this. My son had a name, and I didn't understand why the hospital didn't deem it necessary to use his name and for them to make him more of a person. To them, he wasn't. It was something that they had gotten out of me, and that's the way they made me feel with it. My name was on all of it and not his. And he was a person himself and should have been treated that way from the beginning. After a few days, I decided that I wanted to look in the memory box that the hospital had given us. When I had first been told about either birthing or surgery, I was told I wouldn't get it if I didn't birth. I guess they had decided that I could get it once my doctor had done those footprints, and I guess it was something to put them in for me. When I opened it up, it was obvious that nobody had even looked at it to see what was in it, to make sure that it was appropriate things to be in the box they were giving me for my son. There was a bunch of different hats. There were things that were, for a girl or a boy. They hadn't taken the time to make sure it was personalized for me and Ace. It was just what they are given, and they just pass it out. I did find in the box, though, a card for an organization called SOBBS, for stories of babies born still. So I went on to Facebook and I joined that page, and through them I heard about CuddleCots. It was something that I didn't understand why our hospital didn't have this. When I looked into it, no one in Florida really had them, and I just didn't understand why. I looked into them, and it was like a Moses basket, and it had a way to keep the baby cool so that the baby can stay with you in the room and that you can have that time with them. It's something that now I feel so strongly about, because everybody should be given time to spend with their baby, time to have that baby in the room, not for nursing staff and doctors to take them all through and them have them. Because when you do have a baby in the hospital, it's with you and you get to do everything for it. And just because my son wasn't there, they felt anymore that it wasn't important for me to have that time with him. But it was. It was so extremely important. And if there had been a CuddleCot and they had been more understanding, my parents could have gone to come to the hospital and seen him in person before, over a day goes by where we didn't really know how he was being taken care of. They were trying to maintain the way he looked. or they had just kind of given up on that and weren't concerned about it. I might have chosen for my children to be able to come and see their brother, and my parents been able to come and see him, and us to take pictures and things when he was in better condition, when he had just been born. But we didn't have those options because we didn't have this piece of equipment. It's something I think every hospital should have to have. Had there been a CuddleCot at the hospital, and had their procedures been different and policies that they told me, to where he could be with me right after I came out of surgery, I could have spent time with him, spent days with him if that's what I had wanted, and not just, 30 minutes. He would have been able to be by my side, and I could have bathed him and dressed him and done things that a mother should be able to do. Because those moments at the hospital were all I had. That was it. People don't like to talk about it, I think, and it's just a subject that's definitely shied away from, but it happens. Every day, 1 in 160 births is a stillborn child. So these things happen, and whether hospitals want to talk about it or not, babies do die sometimes, and they need to be prepared for when that does happen, and treat these mothers like they matter as much as the mothers who are leaving with their babies. The most I can do now for my son is try to change the way things happen and try to make it better. I want to give every mother that gift of time with their baby before they have no more time with them at all.